Hello, we're live. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the This Is Not Therapy Hour. I am Brandon Tessers, LCPC. I'm a licensed therapist, but this is not therapy for very, very, very many reasons. This is just an open conversation. It's just a live stream. It's just a chat. Uh, I'm here to talk about whatever. I always pick a topic to start the conversation, just so that there's not like pressure for those of you here in the chat to have to put things out while I'm just sitting here staring silently. Uh, but we don't have to stay within that topic. We can go wherever we go. I appreciate those of you who are here. I appreciate those of you who are watching it after the fact. And I especially appreciate those of you who are participating in the chat so that it feels less like it's just me talking into the void, which, is something I'm still willing to do, even if that's all it is. I run a small practice called Effective Artistry. We do therapy. We also have executive functioning coaches that we work with. We specialize in utilizing a neurodiversity affirming approach and bringing an awareness of executive functioning and executive dysfunction into the therapeutic process. We do individual, couples, families. We're just about to launch a parenting group, a neurodiversity affirming parenting group. We do lots of stuff. I don't know. Effective Artistry, that's our logo in the corner. Look us up if you're interested. But otherwise, we're just here to chat about whatever. I am speaking with no authority other than just my personal knowledge and opinion of what might be helpful to say, because that's what I'm aiming for, is to be helpful. So we've gotten some questions, or not questions, I guess, but requests for a certain topic to be discussed. Well, questions either way. And what was proposed for me to talk about today was something we're seeing people asking: what makes a good therapist? Which is a very loaded question. Let me start with something more practical, just in case that's what people are asking the question in order to try and help with, is how do I find a therapist that's a good fit for me? Because, of course, good is way too generic of a descriptor. There's no such thing as a good therapist for any client, or so we can talk about traits in isolation, or categorically is what I think is better versus worse. But for an individual, if you're looking for therapy, it's about the fit. It's about finding the person and the approach that work best for you, whatever that is. And unfortunately, there's limited ways to do that. But if that's what you're looking for, if you're looking for help on how to go about the process of finding someone to work with, it's going to involve some trial and error. Do some research at first, certainly. Try not to get overly wrapped up in the theoretical approach. First of all, theory doesn't matter a ton, and I feel like that's a little bit heterodoxical to say, but it's also part of the literature. It's in the research where every therapist is taught that technique is probably the least influential factor on client outcomes in terms of the therapeutic process. But it's the thing that is easiest to discuss in writing. So when you're going to do research, you're going to find a lot more about, like, okay, here's what CBT is, here's what DBT, here's what psychodynamic, object relations, client focus, whatever the different approaches you're looking up. It's good to know those things, but try not to overly focus on that. You might find that the therapists that you meet with or have available to you to meet with that practice a particular theory you find interesting are just not good fits, and a person that practices a theory you don't like might be a great fit. So weight that, but don't get overly dedicated to it, I would suggest. Next thing from there is you got to talk to people. Yeah, look up their profiles. And Psychology Today, we list on a website called Inclusive Therapists, which is obviously specifically for people who are looking for an inclusive approach in therapy. So look up profiles and look at trusted sources, but also, especially if you're using insurance, you have a constrained set of choices to be able to utilize your insurance. Look at the list that your insurance company gives you. And then my big thing is, if they don't offer a free consultation, if you don't have an opportunity to get to meet with them or talk or interact with them at all before committing to paying for a session, I consider that to be a pretty big red flag. Not that there's never an appropriate time to do that, but in terms of, if I'm looking for somebody to work with, I want to be able to experience a bit of interaction with them beforehand, before committing to getting into a session where I'm supposed to start doing therapeutic work with somebody. I see a lot of debate go back and forth on this, just generally, in the online sphere and all that, about what's okay to ask a therapist or not okay to ask a therapist, and etc. And again, what I would say is that therapists are humans, and they are not obligated to answer any damn question that you want to ask them. They're free, like anybody else, to say, yeah, I don't really want to answer that question. But you should be made to feel safe in asking whatever question you want to ask. Even if my response is going to be, I don't really want to answer that question, that's too personal or whatever, that's a valid response. It doesn't mean that you're a bad person for having asked the question. So if you're feeling any kind of guilt or shame, or like you're doing therapy wrong or asking the wrong things, bringing up the wrong things, have the wrong ideas, anything like that, I would stay away from that. In terms of like across the board, what I think makes a good therapist, I don't know. I think the most important skill is listening. And I know that probably sounds a little bit, I don't know, underwhelming or anticlimactic. But that's just because we don't really talk about listening as the skill that it is. Listening is not a binary, you listen or you don't listen. There's the extent to which you listen, the ability to hear and interpret and check and get more information to clarify and understand while holding off on judgment is not something that happens generally in day-to-day life. So all of the other things I would say are kind of what I would consider inevitable knock-on effects of somebody who's actually listening and paying close attention to the client in front of them. Things like your experience, your self-report of your experience, what you say of your experience should take precedence over anything and everything else. I think it's not that it's never helpful or never appropriate for a therapist to challenge you and to say, that seems a little convenient as an explanation or whatever. That's an important part of the process. But that's as a prompt for you to explore things for yourself, right? Not to say, if I said, well, that explanation seems convenient, it's as a prompt for you to then respond and say, okay, well, let me look more closely. Am I feeling like it's convenient? Do I think that is it convenient but also accurate? Am I making something up here? Whatever. I'm not going to say that's not true because it's too convenient, because my word doesn't supersede yours. You should be safe. You can't do any therapy if you don't feel physically and emotionally safe. The work of therapy is about making changes. And to do that, you have to be vulnerable and explore things in great depth and detail. And you can't do that when you're not feeling safe. The therapist I had that I really liked almost made me cry when he used my own metaphor to describe a situation back to me. Such a simple thing, but it showed he really was listening and understood. Yeah. One of the things that I train therapists to do is, there's a concept in what's called play therapy, which is usually done with small children, where you are not allowed to name anything until they name it first. So in play therapy, obviously you'll have toys set out and you're just playing and they're playing and you're interacting. And they may pick up a toy helicopter and fly it through the air. You don't say, oh, wow, I see you're flying that helicopter through the air. You say, oh, I see you picked up that thing. You're moving that thing through the air with your hand. And if they say, yeah, it's a helicopter, then you call it a helicopter. If they say, yeah, it's a rocket ship, then you call it a rocket ship. And that's why we don't use language to name and label things before the client does. We don't follow that exactly, that process exactly. We are more didactic. This is talk therapy generally, what we're doing. So we'll ask. We'll say, oh, and what would you call that? Or, okay, you're feeling depressed. What does that mean? I know what depression as a word means. What is your particular personal experience of depression? It's different for different people. I want to know more about you. The focus, especially early on, but really always, should be on hearing what you're saying and then checking with you to make sure that they've got what you're saying. It's not nearly as much about what I think, trying to dispel myths that nobody's even putting forward. Um, yeah, there's Carl Rogers, who is kind of like, I don't know what people's official like nickname titles would be, but I certainly have heard him discussed as like the father of counseling. He's kind of the first professional counselor. Uh, he developed the client focused approach or person centered approach. Um, is a kind of the first in what we would call humanistic approaches to therapy, where it's all about listening and responding to the client and helping them on their journey, not prescribing what you think that they need to be doing or should be doing. Uh, he listed out what he called the necessary and sufficient conditions of therapy, which means that that all of these things must be true in order for a therapeutic process to be beneficial. And if all of these things are true, then the therapy process will be beneficial. Other things can modify how beneficial or in what particular ways, but as long as those things are true. And without going into all the details, because I can't even remember all six of them off the top of my head, they're all in the direction of I have to be listening to you. I have to be authentic in my responses to you. I have to be authentic in my responses to you in a way that you are able to detect my authenticity. Uh, Unconditional positive regard, which is often misunderstood, but my interpretation, the way I find it useful to talk about unconditional positive regard, is I don't make assumptions. That you could say anything, and no matter how bad it sounds, I'm not going to just run with what it sounds like and make a judgment. I'm going to say, well, okay, give me more information. Because if it sounds bad to me, then there's probably something I'm missing. And I want to figure out what that is. So unconditional positive regard is that approach. It's that presumption that if something sounds bad to me, I'm missing something, as opposed to if something sounds bad to me, it's because it's bad. It's really difficult to listen very closely and very well, especially when you're in a role of responsibility or, at the one end of a power dynamic, or you're meant to be an expert or people are asking for help because you want to rush, you want to provide solutions. And that's not a thing that you can do with any like actual nuance because I'm not there in your life. Right. So as people, the more you know about something, the less likely you are to pay attention to any given instance of that thing. The more likely you are to just identify, oh, this is that. And I know that, and that I got to do this and this and this. So I just stop listening. And in therapy terms, that often is I'm doing an assessment. Oh, you have OCD. Okay, I don't need to hear any more specific details because now I know enough to know you have OCD. And when it's OCD, you do this and this and this. And that works for people. I personally don't think that's the best approach generally, but there's also logistical constraints. How much can you afford therapy and, managed care, allowing certain numbers of sessions and etc. Most therapists I've had seem to automatically assume that my problem is negative self-talk or something about what I'm telling myself is wrong. So it feels like they're always looking for something wrong in what I'm saying. Yeah, that's an unfortunate and common. So a lot of this is a problem of scale, that if you are looking for a therapist, if you're wanting to work with somebody, it means that you have made a determination for whatever reason that you think talking through things that are difficult or potentially painful or dangerous to talk through, that you think talking through those things would be beneficial, and that you want to do it with somebody where you have reasonable confidence, reasonable ability to assume that they know how to talk through those things with you in a way that makes it so that it won't be harmful or problematic, right? That it will be beneficial. And you don't know all the therapists. You don't know their personalities. You don't know them as people and as friends. In fact, one of our ethical obligations is to avoid dual relationships, which means a therapist and a client cannot have any other relationship with each other besides therapist and client, not friends, not family members, not, my friend's wife, or, not business partners, not anything other than therapist client. Not because, well, see, I'm just responding to myths now, but you'll hear people say things like, why would I pay someone to talk to me? A friend should talk to me for free or whatever, right? And yeah, you hopefully have friends to talk to. Maybe you don't. And that would be a really good reason to try and find a therapist if that's an option for you. But hopefully you do. But talking is not a binary thing of you're either talking or not talking. You talk in different ways and about different things, and it goes differently. And even if your friend is great and helpful and a wonderful listener, you're not paying them, which doesn't mean that, oh, they're not good. If they were good, you would pay them. It's not the point. The point is that if you're talking with someone and you are just talking about yourself and your problems, and all the conversations are focused on you and how to improve and explore things for you, that's a that's not an equal relationship. It's unsustainable. It doesn't work well over time. There has to be something going in the other direction. And so with friends, that's, we talk about my stuff, we talk about your stuff, we do stuff together, it all balances out over time. With therapists, it's we talk about my stuff and focus on me, and I pay you. That's the exchange. Otherwise, even if the other person isn't someone who's going to get resentful of trying to help with things all the time, you'll become more and more reticent to say anything over time. You'll feel more and more guilty over time about, oh, am I using them too much, and blah, blah, blah. So no, you can't know any of these therapists. That's why we have therapy licensure as a form of credentials, to give some credibility and say, look, you can trust that this person is likely to be well suited to this task. I think that that's not the most helpful way to look at it. I think it's most helpful to look at it as, yes, this person has checked some boxes and met criteria, which means they have some experience in education. And most importantly, if they do cause you harm in some way, they have a regulating body that you can report them to. And I know that's, I don't know, maybe a pessimistic way to approach it, but there are harmful therapists out there. There are people who have bad intent and become therapists because they like the ability to abuse that role. So I don't think being a licensed therapist should be taken as, oh, this person knows what they're doing and they will help me and they're good and etc. But it does mean that there are consequences to their actions, as opposed to, if a friend or family member or coach, which obviously I believe in the value of coaching, it's just not therapy. If those people cause harm or do something unethical, there's not much you can do about it. There was a study I heard about where they concluded that people that were better educated in a subject were more able to interpret news articles in a way that fits their preconceived notions. Yeah. Aren't therapists allowed to make mistakes as well? I have no expectation of perfection in any relationship that I choose to pursue. Yeah, of course. Yeah. Therapists are humans. Again, there's a lot of debate over that in particular, in part because Freud, who founded psychology as a discipline, and therapy and psychology are related. They're not the same thing, but the Freudian psychoanalytic approach involves what they call a blank slate therapist, that the therapist should not exist in any defined way they would refer to a client as a patient, that a therapist should not exist in a patient's psyche in any defined way in order to be able to make it as easy as possible for transference to occur. Transference is when a client projects onto their therapist feelings that are really about other people in their lives, more or less. You're transferring your feelings towards father figures onto your therapist, or towards authority figures onto your therapist, or towards your ex, or whatever. Countertransference is the term for when the therapist then does that back to the client, that they're transferring their feelings and thoughts about somebody else, some other thing, onto you. So projection is very important in certain theories, certain approaches, and so they work very hard to make that easy. So if it's beneficial to a client for them to think of me as a father, then I don't want there to be pictures in my office of me, on vacation solo, because that might detract. They might say, oh, well, I guess he probably doesn't have kids if he's got pictures of himself on vacation by himself, or whatever. Or if they need to think of me, it's beneficial for some reason for them to think of me as not having children, then I don't want pictures in my office with kids. So that's one way of thinking about it. I tend to be on the opposite end of the spectrum from that approach, which is, yeah, therapists are human, and that means flawed and that make mistakes and have biases and things. There is not an option to circumvent that. Anybody who believes that you can eliminate bias just doesn't understand what bias is, and they're especially prone to being biased because they'll have thoughts that they have eliminated their biases, so they stop being vigilant about it. Oh, I don't have biases anymore, so you can't. Why would I look more closely at that, right? So I think it's more beneficial to be honest and authentic and open. That, yeah, you want to ask me my political leanings, you have every right to that information as a client. You want to ask me about my religious background, you have every right to ask that question. I am still a person and I have the right to set boundaries and say, oh, I'm not really comfortable answering that question, which might mean that you and I are not a good fit. If that information is important to you and it's not something I want to share, then we're probably not a good fit without you having done something wrong in asking a bad question, or me having done something wrong in not being comfortable sharing information that you ask for. We're just each doing what works for us because that's what we're looking for. I think that therapy tends to be thought of as a branch of medicine, and it is not. It's a completely different process from medicine. This isn't even touching on like biology and etiology and all that stuff. It's just the process of what you do is different. In medicine, there is what we can describe as healthy functioning, and anything outside of that may or may not be something that needs to be addressed, but it is a sign of suboptimal functioning, right? Therapy isn't that. It isn't that you're broken and you need to be fixed or injured and need to be healed. Those are things that happen, or at least those are ways to be able to talk about things that happen. We can talk about a traumatic experience as effectively equivalent to like a psychological injury and that you need to heal from that. That's a very useful way for people to explore things often. But that doesn't mean that that's the same as when we're talking about healing in a medical context. Therapy is much more like an art than a science. And that has its advantages and disadvantages. One of the disadvantages is it's very difficult to know who is going to be a good fit. So that's why I rely back on authenticity and visibility. That's why I put all this stuff out here so that even without having to schedule a free consult, which you can do with me, and I make those available to anybody, you don't even have to potentially be a client. I've had consults with people who had no intention of doing therapy. They just wanted to ask some questions, and I'm happy to do that. Really, I would love to be able to talk to anybody about anything they want to know about. If I can be helpful or potentially be helpful, I want to do that all the time for free. And I can't, but I can make myself available for free that much. But even less than that is this, that you can just tune in and watch a thing or go see a YouTube video. Do I think everything I'm saying is perfect and brilliant and helpful and genius? Definitely not. If you watch this, you know I am very insecure about, is this worth what I think it's worth? Is this beneficial? I'm worried about blah, 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 which I think is good. I think it's good to stay vigilant about that stuff. But I'm not presenting this to sell anybody about, oh, you should work with us because we're going to help you. I'm presenting this to say, this is what you're going to get if you come work with us. And if that's interesting to you, great. And if not, great. I'm glad you figured that out. I'm glad you had the information you needed to be able to make that determination before wasting your time talking to us or money setting up a session. Is it possible to be anonymous and still do therapy, or does that hamper the ability to make changes? That's a good question. So logistically, I don't know that it is possible to be anonymous just because of like paperwork and legal requirements and things like that. It might be. It might. I don't know if it is or is not. If by anonymous what we mean is like the therapist doesn't even have your name. That's a good question, honestly. I haven't thought of that, but I'm curious about that now because I don't know what kind of like legal documentation. I know that like we have to, for example, provide HIPAA, whatchamacall. Every time you go to the doctor, they have to give you a a piece of paper that explains to you what HIPAA is and what they're going to do with your information. We have to give people that. So there's like legal requirements of documents that we need. And I don't know if that's something that you can keep your name off of, or use a fake name, or I don't know. But in terms of anonymity, not necessarily keeping it, let's assume that you could do it with a fake name, for example. Your therapist doesn't need to know anything about you other than whatever you're bringing into the therapy room, right? In a way, therapy is always anonymous, or at least I guess should be. It should be approached. The therapist should be approaching it as they know nothing about you other than what you have told them. And in terms of making changes, yeah, you're going to have to talk about, the point of the therapeutic process is to be able to talk about the things that you're facing. It's talk therapy. And I know I'm assuming that you are well aware of that. That's why I'm assuming by anonymity, you're just referring to like not having your name known. And by that, yeah, for sure, that shouldn't get in the way of the process, as long as they have something to call you by. But does it hamper the ability to make changes to like not give any identifying information or specific information about yourself? Yeah, definitely. And I want to be clear, that's not because the therapeutic process is not about you give me the information I need about you, I then do some analysis and give back to you the advice and suggestions of what you should do to fix all your problems, which tends to be how it's thought about, including therapists. We feel that pressure. Even those of us who are clear that that's not what this is supposed to be, we still feel a sense of pressure and responsibility. People are coming to you for help. You wouldn't, at least theoretically, you wouldn't be a therapist if you didn't want to help people who are asking you to help them. So there's a desire to want to help and solve things, and that gets in the way if the therapist doesn't know how to handle it. So it's not that I need any specific information about you so that I can give you good suggestions. It's that if you are keeping an eye on what you can and can't say, it inhibits your ability to get the benefit of therapy. A huge part of the benefit of therapy is just being able to talk with another human being about the kinds of things that you don't normally talk about, which, again, anonymity in terms of nobody knows your name could even be helpful with. It's part of the reason that we do this like this, that I didn't today, but oftentimes I will say, hey, just so you know, if you are, commenting through Twitch, it's your Twitch name, Facebook's your Facebook, etc., so that people know what's there. I want people to be able to be here anonymously and ask questions anonymously, unattached to any account, or, to be able to be traced back to them. Because, yeah, it frees you up to be able to ask questions that you might be ashamed or embarrassed or whatever to ask. So I don't know if I answered your question well. Legally, I don't know if it's allowed to be anonymous. Does it inhibit the process to not have your name or your real name? No, not at all. Does it hamper the process if you're not willing to talk about yourself and reveal specific information about yourself? Yeah, but what exactly things are helpful to share and what are not? Again, this is one of those things. You are in charge. Your therapist is your employee. You're paying them to provide a service for you. And it sometimes doesn't feel like that. It should be something that therapists are aware of, the fact that it doesn't always feel like that. And so they're doing things, we do things to, as best we can, make it clear that that is the arrangement, that this is not an authoritative position that I'm holding. You know more about you than I know about you. That will always, always be true. I know some things that you don't know. None of that is stuff about you. So you tell me things about you, and then I can share with you things that I know about that you may or may not know about, but I think you might find relevant. And then you can determine whether that's a fit or not, whether it's useful or to what extent or in what way it's useful. It is not for me to tell you who you are, which is another thing that gets lost in all the diagnosis and all that nonsense. I don't remember why I started getting into that. Oh, because clients are allowed to lie to their therapists. Clients are allowed to say, I don't want to talk about that. Clients are allowed to say, I don't want to try that. I don't think that will work for me. I don't think that will be beneficial or helpful, or I think it might work for me, but it's not worth the shot, or it might be helpful for me, but it will hurt me and I don't want. Just generally, the most insidious concept in the therapy world to me is what we call client resistance. The idea that if a client behaves differently or responds differently to the therapeutic process than the therapist expects or wants them to, that's an indication that they are resistant to the therapy process, because it puts everything onto the client. It effectively means everything I'm doing and saying is perfectly wonderful and helpful, and if you're not engaging with it in the way that I think that you should be, you're being resistant, not maybe I should shift what I'm doing. And people can hold space for both. You can say that clients are resistant and therefore shift to something else because they're resistant to that thing. But that's not generally the way that it's talked about. It's generally, a way of absolving therapists of responsibility that they shouldn't have taken on in the first place for fixing problems. If a therapist is going into the process saying, I'm here to help you solve all your life's problems, and then those things don't get better, then there's a lot of incentive for that person to say, well, it's because you're doing it wrong. You're not trying the things that I told you to try. You're not really engaging or whatever, instead of looking at whatever in the process might be inhibiting progress. That shouldn't be necessary, because that's not what therapy is. That's, from my understanding of life coaching, that's generally what life coaching is, where they're just giving you, they ask questions and listen to things and of course provide frameworks and things, but also provide you advice. Do this thing, do that thing. This would be good for you. Therapy generally shouldn't be doing that. It's a process of exploration. We're helpful as mirrors and sounding boards and people to be in conversation with, not as people to dictate to you what you must do. Oh, yeah, that's an interesting, disqualifications for being someone's therapist based on a prior relationship. That's an interesting point. And I don't know if, like I said, that might be part of, if it's not allowed to be anonymous, maybe that's part of why. It's also honestly not something that was an option until very recently. Like we're presumably talking about remote work, because you could not give me your name, but if we're meeting in person, I still see your face and like have a sense of you as a person. If you wanted to really like not have any identity, it would have to be remote, either on the phone or video with the camera turned off. And yeah, that would make it impossible to know. Not impossible, I guess they could tell from the voice and whatever. Let me say this, that the largest portion of the benefit of therapy, to the extent that it is beneficial for somebody, comes from the relationship, not the advice, not the techniques, not the theory, the relationship. And it's difficult to have a relationship in which you're not feeling, it's difficult to have a relationship in which you feel safe to explore all the things that might come up for you, while also not feeling safe to reveal your identity to somebody. But I can't make that a general blanket statement. Good coach helps clients make choices to experiment with it. Did that produce what you hope to produce? Yes. Keep making that choice. No, let's explore other choices. Cool. Yeah, I agree. Like I said, we have executive functioning coaches here. I believe in the work of coaching, and that's the way that it should be explored. That it's not prescriptive. It's not you should do this or you should do that. It's let me talk through this with you and add some things and some perspective, or reframe some things, or present different options that you might not have been aware of, and just keep you paying attention to this thing. I'm just laughing at that comment from my dad there. Yeah, it's not possible to be an unbiased observer. That's not a thing. And it's starting to take me in a different direction than talking about what it is to be a good therapist. Yeah, it's listening, like real good, deep listening, not just hearing enough So brain is a cognitive miser, right? We talk about this all the time. Cognitive miser theory means the brain doesn't spend resources unless it has a reason to do so. It's not a, it's just a description. It's a way of looking at things that we observe. It's not a thing that might potentially be true. It's just a potentially accurate way to describe things that we observe. What that means is when you listen to somebody, you listen the bare minimum extent that you need in order to get the information that you need to move forward without issue. And so it depends on who you're talking to, what is the point of talking to them, what are you trying to get out of it, what do you need to do next, etc. But we don't hear everything every person says, not anywhere close to it. And I'm just talking about words right now. You don't hear every single word that a person is saying. You don't even hear every single word that you say. And we can do stuff with that. But so listening in the way that is, I think, most appropriate for therapists to listen involves treating everything as meaningful, because your brain will not pay attention to something that has no impact, no meaning, no value. You can try and force yourself to pay attention to stuff like that, but in order to do that, you're expending mental effort that is unsustainable and requires that you're spending some of your attention on yourself to monitor to what extent you're listening or not, which inhibits your ability to listen as fully as you could. So, yeah, it's very difficult. Well, I should say it's impossible to listen 100% to someone. It's not actually doable to hear. And I should clarify too, I'm using terms like listen and hear. What we're talking about is observation and perception. It's not just about auditory information. It's whatever way you're getting information about the other person, whatever way that you're communicating, how you're picking that up. So listening is a shorthand, and I should try to do a better job of reframing that as observing instead of listening, paying attention to. We hear all kinds of and I even say some of this stuff that doesn't really mean, like it can't be defined, but it means something to the right person in the right context. Things like you got to listen to what's not being said, or listen to the reverse of what they're saying, and et cetera, et cetera. But all of it just comes down to paying very close, deep, detailed attention to the other person, and then responding to that person. Because when you pay that close of attention to someone, anyone, anything, it impacts you. It shapes your world and your experience, and that generates responses. We respond to stimuli. The work of being a therapist, maybe this is, I don't know, maybe I'm just getting real philosophical here, but what makes someone a good therapist is not the ability to hear what you're saying or observe, pay attention to your communication in session, think it through, come up with a brilliant response, and give you that brilliant response. Good therapists shouldn't be thinking that much during a session about what they might say. They shouldn't be thinking really very much at all about it. But that only works if you do a lot of work in between sessions to make sure that your default response, your unconsidered response, is beneficial. Like if you think of it in any other field, think of it as an athlete, right? A professional basketball player. We want them during the game to not have to think about what they're doing. But in order to be able to not have to think about what they're doing, and yet still what they do is beneficial, gets towards what they're trying to accomplish, means that there has to be a lot of thought and effort and work and practice put in outside of the game, so that when the time for the game comes, the reactions are instantaneous. A lot of therapy really puts intelligence up on a pedestal. A lot of therapeutic approaches more or less rely on the idea that the therapist is more intelligent or knowledgeable than the client and leans on that. And that really doesn't have a place there, I think. General advice for knowing whether you have an addiction to something. So I guess I have some concept of whether a behavior is problematic because it's causing problems in your relationships or hampering your ability to complete your responsibilities to your job, etc. But for the purpose of addressing the issue and making positive changes, I'd assume it's useful to know whether something is an addiction or something that you just need to cut back on a bit. I hope that makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense. So Addiction is one of those terms that gets thrown around for a lot of different things and ends up being very confusing and whatever. So the first question would always be, what's the point of deciding whether it's an addiction or not? You've already stipulated the point here is, if it's an addiction, I would do X in order to try and address it. If it's not an addiction, I might do Y in order to try and address it. Or maybe you don't know, but you'd figure different things out, right? So we want to know why the meaning for the distinction. And then you can evaluate why that distinction would help you determine one of those paths. And then you can just look for that instead of wondering whether it qualifies as an addiction. So one thing I think is helpful to talk about here is addiction and dependence. Like, these words get used different ways. There are some things that if you utilize them, you become physically dependent on them, which means if you stop utilizing them, you go through a process of withdrawal where your body does not have what it needs. In other words, some things replicate or mimic biological processes, and if you do those things enough, your body and your brain stop doing the biological processes. This is how like a lot of tolerance is created, that it comes to rely on the external source of that thing. And if you stop the external source, it takes some time for the body to ramp up its ability to make up the gap, on its own again, even to the extent that you can die. Alcohol is one of the most dangerous addictions, because if you quit alcohol cold turkey, when you are dependent on it to a certain extent, you can die, which is not true of all addiction things. If you're not talking about physical dependence, meaning my body will be damaged in some way or incapacitated in some way by stopping this thing, then we're talking about enjoyment. And it can be lots of different purposes. Why do you do this thing? You wouldn't even be wondering whether it's an addiction or not if it wasn't clear to you, or that you had an idea that doing it the way that you're doing it or to the extent that you're doing it is problematic. So there's two different things I think are important to look at when you're talking about addictions. One is, are you experiencing current problems and you're wondering whether the behavior that you're worried is an addiction is impacting those or creating or worsening those problems? Or are you not experiencing any problems that you think are directly related to the addiction? You're just worried that it is in some way unhealthy or bad for you that will result in problems down the line. Because those are two very different things. Is it something that's actually happening right now, or is it something that you think over time will start to cause you problems if you don't make changes? That's one, I think, useful way to look at it, because it changes what you do, and maybe we'll have time to talk about like the two different paths. The other is that it's just a way of putting a label on, what do I want to say? We have a tendency to talk about psychology and psychiatry as though they're like very clearly defined sciences, and they're not. What I mean by that is dopamine. We know what dopamine is. We know what experience dopamine at certain levels or certain release, we know what experiences that correlates with, because people can report. I think I have some kind of issue with boredom dopamine or something. Spend a lot of time on Reddit video games. I feel like it's more than I should be spending there, but I'm not really sure what to do, because if I'm bored, those behaviors are pretty ingrained. Now that's a good question. And all right, so let me very briefly wrap up the general addiction thing and then come to that. Generally, what you'll find is that we put addiction as a label on things that are considered vices, sins, socially verboten, right? That gambling is an addiction, sex is an addiction, porn can be an addiction, video gaming, online, social media can be an addiction, but nobody ever talks about being addicted to gardening or being addicted to bowling. Or dopamine is correlated with the experience of, well, many things, but primarily what we're talking about is enjoyment. It's often called the reward chemical, right? That you do something enjoyable and then you get a rush of dopamine. Just generally, the problem with isolating like neurochemicals from the subjective lived experience is that it's not causal, it's different ways of observing the same phenomenon. Like if a cow is over there, I can see the cow and it looks like this, and I can hear the cow and it sounds like this. Those two things both originate from the cow, but the cow doesn't look the way that it looks because of how it sounds, or sound how it sounds because of how it looks. They're just different ways of observing. So we can observe neurochemicals through, laboratory processes, but for a person to observe their own subjective lived experience, we do that through consciousness and metacognition and emotionality. One doesn't cause the other. So when we're talking about, I do this thing in order to get dopamine, there's no meaningful difference between saying I do this thing to get some dopamine and I do this thing because I like doing it. It's the same thing, it's just using different language to describe it. If you are bored, then you're bored, and there's no other clinical diagnosis that you need in order to be able to deal with that. You just want to know what you deal with, what you do to deal with boredom. And we can talk about like generally helpful or frequently helpful things to do when someone is experiencing boredom, but ultimately it will rely on you specifically. If the things that you're doing help alleviate the boredom and don't cause you other problems, then what are we talking about? Right? So again, we're back to that. Is it causing an actual problem, or is it just an idea that you're doing it more than you should and therefore it might cause a problem later on? If it's just an idea that it's different than what it should be without any ability to attach that to specifics, then regardless of whether or not it would qualify or someone would consider that it would qualify as an addiction, it doesn't give you much to do about it because it's not actually causing a problem. Generally, if there is something that you're doing that you don't like doing, because we don't need to call it an addiction or qualify it that way to just say, I do this more than I wish I did it, right? If you want to be doing something less, the best thing that you can do, the only sustainable thing that you can do, is to find other ways to spend your resources, preferably other ways to spend your resources that will meet the same needs that the addictive behavior is meeting. So in this case, you're being pretty clear that you spend time on Reddit and playing video games because it alleviates boredom. Well, first, I would suggest it could be helpful to you to start to identify that that's probably not always the case. Sometimes you go on Reddit or play video games in response to an experience of, I am bored, I don't know what to do, I'm going to go on Reddit. I am bored, I don't know what to do, I'm going to play video games. Sometimes you play video games because you want to play the game that you have. You're excited, you're thinking about it. It's a new game that just came out, or you had to pause and you're ready to get on. You can do it because you want the experience, not because you're using it to avoid some negative experience. And yes, we can reframe it that way, but we can reframe anything that way. We can say that you eat to avoid the experience of hunger, right? You breathe to avoid the experience of, what's it called? Hypoxia? Is that the technical term for not having enough oxygen? So likely, or at least possibly, what you're dealing with here is just that you're bored a lot more often than you want to be, and you're looking for a reason for why you're bored, and then you're looking at the things that you do in response to the boredom to alleviate it, and then putting them in a cycle that I play the video games because I'm bored, but playing the video games makes me bored, and so on and so forth. That might be true sometimes, but start to distinguish. Be more clear with yourself about why you're playing it, because it's different for different times. More importantly, look at what boredom is. Could it be some kind of biological dopamine deficiency? Sure. But you're also not bored all the time, or at least you're not bored in exactly the same way or to exactly the same extent all the time. Sometimes you're more bored, sometimes you're less, moment to moment. So regardless of whatever extent it's a biological thing, there are other factors that impact it, and work with the parameters that you have. If you think it's a biological thing, then you can go look into diagnosis and medication and those kinds of processes. If you think that there are other factors that might impact it besides biology, you can look at those things, right? So you can impact whatever you can impact. Medication might not always be a choice, but some things are within your control. Choices within constraints. the general answer, the generic answer to the initial question about addiction is clinically, generally, you're going to focus on two things. Number one, are you doing this thing even though you wish you weren't? Or are you doing this thing more than you wish you were? You have an active intention to do it less or not at all, and you keep doing it or doing it more than you mean to. That's one. The other is, does the extent to which you engage in this thing inhibit your functioning in social, occupational, academic, or relational contexts? That clinically, whenever someone's talking about functioning in terms of mental health, clinically what they mean is academic, occupational, social, or relational. So at school, at work, in the way that you interact with other people, or in the way that you navigate your relationships, even if you're not directly interacting. If the answer to those things is yes, then generally people will call that addiction. But just remember, video games are no more addictive than gardening for the people who like gardening. One of the biggest differences that does cause noticeable different patterns of usage is that the cost of engaging in video games is much, much, much lower than the cost of engaging in gardening. In other words, no matter how much you enjoy gardening, over time, your body becomes more tired and uncomfortable in the positions that you need to be in. Over time, the sun goes down and the seasons change, and you can't just garden whenever you feel like gardening all the time, all over the place. In fact, over the pandemic, if you look at some people's experience of houseplants where you can engage much more at will, but even then you can't overwater it. There are built-in things you have to stop. But some people have talked about houseplant addictions. It just is, you have access to a thing that you enjoy. It doesn't cost you much energy or money, maybe a lot of time. But if you're bored, what that means is you have a lot of time on your hands where you don't have other things that you would need to be able to spend that time in a way you find more meaningful. Whether that's because you have ideas of things to do, but not the energy to do it, or you have the energy to do things, but no ideas of what to do, or you have ideas and energy, but you don't have the resources that you would need in order, whatever it is. At the end of the day, though, if you don't like something that you're doing or something that anybody's doing and you want to change it, trying to remove that option is at best a very high energy, high effort, short-term solution. Because the resources that you've been spending on that thing, if you ban yourself from that thing, or even just try to restrict yourself from that thing, those resources free up. I was playing 8 hours of video games a day. Now I'm only playing 2. Well, what do I do with the other 6 hours? If it works in a long-term way, what happens is you're forcing yourself to explore what other things are worth spending your time and energy on instead. But you can also do that on the front end. In other words, rather than beating yourself up for doing something that you think is bad, whether bad is harmful, whether bad is just suboptimal or a waste or whatever, rather than beating yourself up for doing something that you think is bad, find a better option for yourself. You will not have any long-term success in modifying anybody's behavior, but we're focused on your own, right? You won't have any long-term success modifying your own behavior if all you do is keep taking away the best options that you have found. If you think that what you're doing isn't great, acknowledge it's the best option you have and try to come up with better ones instead of acting as though there should be a better option, even though in practice there isn't, right? I could be working out with this time, whatever. Theoretically, you could spend that time that way, but do you have the energy and the other resources for it, right? Deal with the reality of what you're dealing with. I think a helpful way to look at this, I don't know, it's just a fun way for me to say it, I guess. It is totally reasonable to not like certain things about yourself, about what you think or feel or do or are. It's perfectly reasonable to want to change things about yourself. I don't think it's possible not to have at least some things that you want to change about yourself. I don't know what people would be thinking about if there was nothing that they wanted to change. You find things that you want to change. So yeah, you're going to feel that way. And then know that you are exactly who you have to be to navigate all the things that you have had to navigate. So if you want to be different, you have to navigate different things. You can't do the same things, experience the same things, fulfill the same criteria, and somehow magically be different anyway. We call that magical thinking, and that comes into therapy a lot, where people just want to feel happy without changing anything that's happening. And I don't mean this to say, get off your ass and make changes. I mean this to say, you may not like things about yourself. And if those things are true about yourself, it's because they've had to be in order for you to get through what you've been getting through. We are shaped by the lives that we live. If you are bored more frequently than you want to be bored, well, here's something that's probably true. You don't have demands on your time and energy and attention that are meaningful to you and independent of you in terms of initiating them. You're waiting around for somebody to give you a call. In fact, I wrote a blog years ago about, in the Joseph Campbell's exploration of like the hero with 1,000 faces, human stories and narrative, like as a whole. There's the call to action in these stories. There's the status quo, and usually the status quo is bad. And when we're talking about things that are made for teenagers and older, when it's below, the status quo is good. That's a whole other thing. The status quo is bad. Oftentimes bad in the sense that it's comfortable and safe, but boring. It's Luke on the moisture farm, right? That there's nothing inherently terrible about it, except it's just boring. And then there's the call to action. Something happens. R2-D2 plays a bit of a message from Princess Leia referencing Kenobi, and you know a guy with the last name Kenobi. Gandalf knocks on your door. Gandalf draws a rune on your door so a bunch of dwarves show up and have dinner, right? The call to action is something external to the protagonist, something that happens regardless of them initiating it, that clarifies to them that they have some destiny or purpose beyond what they already know. There's a reason that's in stories, and that's universally appealing to us. We all want to get that letter in the mail that says, hey, you thought you were just normal, but you're actually super cool and magical and rich. And yeah, that's a Harry Potter reference, and I don't really want to reference Harry Potter, but there's certain stories that are just in the zeitgeist and more accessible. So a lot of times people get stuck waiting for that call to action, especially those of us, and I'm talking about myself here, who love genre fiction and who love video games and movies and analyzing things and reading, and because those are all forms of narrative. And narrative, we make narrative be what we wish life was. You skip the boring parts in narratives. It's a training montage, not actually 10 years of doing the same exercises for 4 hours a day. Right? We don't watch people brush their teeth unless it's meaningful to the story, right? So these narratives are explicitly what we want them to be, that life is not and cannot be. And one particular pattern that I have found to be useful to call to attention to is waiting for that call to action. Just looking at your life and having a hard time saying specifically, here's the hugely problematic thing, other than it's unfulfilling, it's boring, it's not very meaningful, there's no point, what am I doing, that kind of stuff. And you're waiting for somebody to pop up and say, hey, actually, you have a magical destiny, let's go explore it. Which, just as a note, the theme of my office, I'm a nerd. I designed this office with the theme in mind of adventure, of I'm here to be Gandalf, not to tell you what to do or where to go or what's right, but to just prompt you, give you things to react to that are different than the things you're normally reacting to, so you react differently than you normally do. And then I'm on the journey with you as we explore things, and I'm helping best I can to keep things safe and to point out like, oh, don't go over there, that's bad stuff or whatever, while we figure that stuff out together. And then you return from the journey changed. That's what the monomyth, the hero with 1,000 faces story is. Start at the status quo that's unfulfilling, go on some adventure, venture into the underworld and lose a mentor, come back changed. That's what we're trying to do. So therapy can be a call to action in that way. I certainly try to make it be that in what I'm doing, that I'm prompting things. I'm giving you different things to react to than what you've had to react to before. So if the video games and the Reddit are alleviating your boredom, but you don't like the extent to which you do them, then you got to find something else to alleviate that boredom. You can ban yourself from those things, but you'll eventually return to them. Nature abhors a vacuum. So if you make a pie chart, this is an exercise I have people do, make a pie chart where you break up in a very simplistic and reductive way resources, time, energy, all your resources, and percentage-wise categorize how many of, what percentage of your resources in total do you spend on different categories of things. You make up the categories. And then you look at that pie chart and say, okay, is there anything here that I want to be spending fewer of my resources on? And you say, is there anything here I want to be spending more of my resources on? Or is there anything that's not in this chart that I want to be in this chart? And you focus on including those things, expanding the resources you're spending on a thing that you're already doing, or starting to spend resources on something that you haven't been doing. And then you have to, in order to make room for that, you have to make cuts. That's why it's good to know, oh, I play video games and look at Reddit more than I like. Because if I need to free up some room to start doing this other thing, well, I'm going to pull it from there. But if you start with just, I'm going to scale back how much I'm playing video games and going on Reddit, well, there's just a big empty chunk in that pie chart. And nature abhors a vacuum. Something will fill that space. You can't cease to exist for 3 hours a day. So something will fill that space. And the easiest and most likely thing to fill that space is for the thing that you are having to put effort into restraining to just re-expand and take it up. So long term, it's much more about finding the things that you want to be doing as opposed to judging yourself for the things that you don't want to be doing as much as you are. That's a lot to say with very little information, and maybe none of it is relevant or helpful to you at all. But I hope that there's some value in that. I have found in the past where there's be some utility in approaching things that way. If you want somebody to be doing something different than what they're doing, give them better options for them, better options that they actually can take and that are not only actually better for them based on the criteria that they're using for what is good or bad, but that they are able to perceive that it is a better option for them. And then you don't have to have this carceral approach of what you're doing is bad and we must eliminate it. Do more good stuff, not try to do less bad stuff. So pithy and blithe and reductive, but I don't know. That's what I can say on a stream. I have to run. Thank you all for being here. I really appreciate the questions and the participation in chat today. I'll be here next week, same time, Wednesday, 1 p.m. I will talk to you all next week. Thanks. Bye.